Have you ever thought that some scriptures don't sound quite right? For instance, blessed are they that mourn. How can it possibly be a blessed thing to mourn? Surely Jesus came to give us joy. So where does mourning fit into the character of a Christian? Well, God has many characteristics, and if we want to be like him, then we have to share in his pain as well as his pleasures. The word blessed means that we're God favoured, and it appears that we're in a very good place so far as God is concerned if our hearts are moved to mourn. We may think of God as being permanently content and happy, but the Bible doesn't confirm this view. Our God has very strong passions and emotions. When reading the Bible, it's apparent that he can both be stirred to anger and moved to pity, and he can mourn and grieve too. Does he not mourn and grieve over the things that happen in the world today? Or does he sit aloof in heaven, uncaring and uninterested? Is he a God without a heart? We know he has a heart, and his heart can be wounded just as ours can be. As Jesus approached his own great battle in Gethsemane, he said to his disciples in Mark 14, verse 34, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful unto death." It says he began to be sore amazed and to be very heavy. Grief and mourning consumed him in that garden. He'd come to show God's children what their Heavenly Father was like, but they hated him and wanted to utterly destroy him. His own crucifixion and death was only hours away. Jesus was depicted by Isaiah as a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And indeed, the Messiah's great work was to identify with the sorrows of mankind, because Isaiah also said, he's borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. To a greater or lesser degree, every one of us will experience and suffer mourning. I remember being 3 months pregnant and should have been so happy as it was Nathan's second birthday. But then I saw blood. Panic rose inside me and I found it very difficult to think clearly. But I picked up the phone and calmly spoke with the doctor. She told me to stay where I was and promised she'd be round to see me within the hour. After a brief checkup, she said that my body was trying to tell me through these warning signals that I was doing too much rushing around after a 2-year-old, and the best thing I could do now was rest as much as possible with my feet up, which in the circumstances I thought was quite laughable. She then told me that if the bleeding continued, I was to go round to the maternity hospital and let them examine me properly. And it was her opinion that they'd probably keep me in for a few days to rest whilst I got over this difficult period. Well, the next day, my condition hadn't improved. So I packed a small bag, then added a bit of correspondence, which I hoped I could catch up on during my hours of freedom from responsibility. Morris accompanied me on to the hospital and we were both taken into a room where I was interviewed. I gave them as many details as possible concerning my pregnancy, after which they gave me a brief examination and then made an appointment for me with the radiography department for a scan. As I was waiting for my name to be called, I remembered my previous appointments here when I'd had the opportunity to see Nathan before he was born. They were thrilling times as I'd been allowed to look inside my own body at the miracle God was performing there. So that day also, I felt tremendous excitement at what progress my baby would be making at this stage. I believed with all my heart that there was nothing wrong and that the pregnancy would go on without any problems. I must say, I felt a bit disappointed lying on the hospital couch because the monitor was up by my head instead of at my feet, so I couldn't see what was on the screen. But I could see clearly Morris's face and that of the radiographer, and I searched them both intently for any telltale signs which would give me a clue as to what was happening. Well, after an external scan, the radiographer, she said that she couldn't comment yet as she couldn't see properly what was happening, so She then proceeded to give me an internal scan. And her face didn't give anything away, as she called somebody over to confer with in medical jargon. And I didn't understand what they were saying. But I remember asking time and again if everything was okay. The radiographer just kept saying she'd let me know when she'd reached a conclusion. She asked me to confirm my pregnancy dates, which I did, then asked me if I was sure of them. And I think at this stage I began to feel uneasy, so I said that maybe I wasn't so sure after all. It was then that she looked at me with pity and she said, "I'm very sorry, but according to your dates, your baby has been dead for the last 4 weeks, and there's severe hemorrhaging all around your womb as your body is preparing to abort the baby." What that radiographer said stunned me, and for a moment I couldn't process her words. Nothing that the doctor had intimated so far had prepared me for what I'd just heard. They hadn't even implied that there could be a possibility that I could lose my baby. For some moments I just stared, then I began to sob involuntarily and uncontrollably. I kept my mouth closed, but my body was jerking as the silent tears came streaming down my face. Oh God, no, please, no. I could see the nurse was full of pity. She pulled off a wad of tissue from a roll and gave it to me. And she began to usher me into a cubicle where she said I could collect myself before I left the department. Morris stood close to me as I sat in the cubicle, and as I clung to his trouser legs, sobbing into his clothing, the pain I felt inside was so intense. Then as I sat there, it seemed like my whole life passed before my eyes, and I remembered all the pain I'd suffered throughout my violent childhood and teens, and I suddenly realised that God had given me a new life. A strange feeling came over me as I realised that God had changed so many things of my circumstances. And I began to look afresh at what God had done for me. As I sat there, I remember saying to Morris, I have no recriminations. God has blessed me so much. I began to thank God for Nathan, my little 2-year-old son, who had already brought so much joy into my life. I thanked God for Morris, who had been the best husband anybody could ask for. He was not only loving and caring, but was also a man of God, somebody I could look up to, respect and take as my example. I thank God also for the fact that he'd called me into the ministry and given me a purpose in life which I knew was worthwhile. And then, like Job, I said with all sincerity, God gives, God takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In a matter of moments, I felt as though I understood that God knew what he was doing, and that if he'd decided this child should not see life, then his decision was good enough for me, and I accepted it. I wiped my face, blew my nose, and took the results from the scan to the lady who had interviewed me at first. After reading the results of the scan, the doctor told me that I ought to stay in hospital and have an operation to remove the dead child from my womb. Although I'd come expecting to be kept in for a few days, I was now very reluctant to stay. All sorts of thoughts loomed up in my mind, and I found myself hoping that God would change his mind concerning what he'd decided to do with my baby. I knew God could perform miracles. I knew God could give life, and I was just hoping that God would change his mind. Although my baby was dead, I didn't want anybody to take it from me. I wanted to nurse it a little longer. Well, in the end, Morris made me see sense, and I agreed to stay and have the operation. Well, once I was established on the ward, the kind nurses tried to give me information on people who'd had miscarriages in the hope that I could cope with the situation. But I didn't feel the need to read any of the material. What I was being faced with now was a lesson which needed to be learned. Was I prepared for God to be the Lord of my life? Could I honestly say, "Thy will be done"? As I pondered these questions, I knew the answer was yes. No matter what the cost, the answer would always be yes. Once my decision was made, I felt my mind relax and peace returned. A couple of days later, I came home from hospital and picked up the threads of life. And to be honest, I thought I'd cope with the situation very well indeed. A few weeks after this event, I happened to be flicking through a magazine and came across an article which pictured a woman holding a newborn baby. A gush of emotion suddenly came over me and I wept uncontrollably, feeling what seemed like an awful physical pain inside my heart. I was quite surprised at my reaction because until then I'd felt as though I'd handled the situation very well. There were times too when I would see a pregnant woman in the street and feel grief begin to rise within me and a sense of despair at what could have been. And I would again cry and feel that physical pain in my heart. These experiences bothered me, and I remember praying and asking God why it was that I felt this way. And God told me that although I'd accepted his decision concerning my baby, I'd actually resented it. The truth was also emphasised by the fact that I'd continually prayed and asked God to give me another child, as I didn't want Nathan to be brought up on his own. And being in my 40s, I knew I was running out of time. I was so desperate for another child that I'd even inquired about adoption, but was informed that because I was over 35 years of age, I was considered too old. Then, months later, in prayer, I finally made my peace with God and told him that I wouldn't only accept, but I'd also be happy with his decision. And that from now on, I'd never pressurise or pester him again, asking for another child. He alone knew the future and knew exactly what I could and couldn't cope with. So I then gathered the whole stack of baby clothes and equipment that I'd saved after having Nathan and gave them all to somebody who lived 100 miles away. In my mind, I'd closed another chapter of that particular book and was not only saying to God I was happy with his decision, but I was also proving it by my actions. Well, a fortnight after the baby things had gone out of the house, I was sick 2 mornings on the run. I mentioned it to Morris, who told me with confidence that I was pregnant. When I asked him to qualify his statement, he said that God had woken him from sleep just a few nights before and told him very clearly that he was going to give him another son. Morris had been so convinced this was the voice of God that he'd written it down in his diary, which he brought to show me. 10 days after this, God gave me a dream telling me to name the child I was carrying Isaac. From that moment, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that no matter what went on during this pregnancy, Isaac would be born as a gift from God to Morris and myself. Not because I'd pressurised him into giving it to us, but because it was his will that we should be blessed with this child. I realised that not everyone who has suffered the loss of a loved one can be consoled the way I was. But I know we all go through these same emotions and experience utter despair. These experiences can either turn us away from God, making us become hard and bitter, or they can turn us towards God and make us more soft and sensitive towards others in similar circumstances. It's a certainty that we'll all experience losing loved ones if we live for any length of time. And the Bible advises us to number our days and spend them wisely. And nothing I know makes us appreciate the brevity of life more than losing someone close. We take so much for granted. Life is a gift, yet we all make so many demands upon God for that life. Someone once said that God can't be everything to us until he's all we've got. And I found with myself this miscarriage that when my heart was the sorest, God was the only one who could pour on the balm I needed to ease the ache and pain of my awful loss. And for those who have a personal relationship with him, this is what God has promised for our eternal future. I'm just going to read some verses from Revelation 21, 1-5. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And he that sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. What a promise. You know, knowing God really does bring comfort, not only in this life, but also in the life to follow when we leave this world. God bless you.